Hello, everyone. Mike here. This week I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm going to break the talk down into three main sections. In the first section, we're going to talk about scientific consensus. We often hear this phrase when we see the news about climate change. We hear different groups questioning whether there is a scientific consensus, others saying that there is a scientific consensus, and this phrase becomes a bit of a battleground. So one of the jobs of philosophy is to try to dig into these types of public phrases and see just what's going on. And if you remember, one of the main aspects of this class is to try to see how science, environmental ethics, and politics mix together. And this phrase is a perfect example of all those three things mixing together. In the second part of the talk, we're going to see how that word scientific consensus plays out into public reporting, how reporting, public discussions, and all of the complicated things that go on about scientific consensus play out in the press. The press handles this a certain way that I want to argue causes more problems than it solves. And so we'll talk about that. Then lastly, I'm going to talk just briefly about what a pragmatic response to this problem might look like. I'm a pragmatic ethicist, and I'll give you an example of how a pragmatist would approach this complicated issue. But before I do any of this, I want to give you my own little short story of a glacier that I canoed up to, which is now gone. Unlike many academic philosophers, I went a little bit backwards. I had a family, children, a couple of jobs before I even went back to get my undergrad, MA, and PhD in philosophy. And for this reason, I have some interesting backstories about the environment. In 1990, I was stationed in Anchorage, Alaska. And just south of Anchorage, there's a highway that leads south out of Anchorage. There's a tiny little river, a big stream, a small river that leads up to what's called Portage Lake. And when I was there in 88, 89, 90, it was an idea of mine to take my canoe. I have a solo canoe, and to take my solo canoe, paddle up this small river up to the glacier and see it. It was really interesting. There's a couple of interesting stories that go with this. But the main point here is that I paddled right pretty closely up to a glacier that was still sticking a fair amount out into the lake. I'm going to show some slides right after this small segment, and I want you to look at the slides and look at the years. I was there a little bit after one of the slides, I believe, is in the 80s, and I was there in the late 80s. The interesting point of this is that today, this glacier is nearly gone. And the massive section that I saw when I was there that stuck out into the lake is completely gone. Some of the parts up near the mountain apparently are holding on, but they're shrinking at an amazingly fast rate. The reason for this is that climate change tends to be much more radically strong closer to the poles. Places like Alaska, which are much further north, are much more affected than places like St. Louis or places in the Midwest type of the world. And so I want you to look at this because it's a shocking thing to me. It was the first thing that I ever saw that really convinced me of the reality of this problem, and more importantly, the speed of the problem, which is very easy to miss if you live in the contiguous United States. But if you travel to the poles, if you go to Alaska or northern Canada or someplace like that, it's a much more obvious thing that's happening, and it's almost shocking. So watch these, and we'll talk afterwards. I wanted to start with that more personal and fast example of climate change, because when we read about climate change in the newspaper, or hear it on the news, or see it on MSN or CNN or Fox News, or we talk to somebody in a classroom about it, it seems very theoretical. It seems very distant. It seems like we're always talking about something that might happen in the future, or something that's happening now but is very small and very difficult to measure. And so I think this public perception of the slowness and the distance leads into maybe a misapprehension of what scientific consensus about climate change means. And so that's why I wanted to show you Portage Glacier. I was there not very long ago in this geologic time. And even since I've been there, it's shrunk significantly. To this point, there's basically no more of the glacier out into the lake. That is very, very fast change. In half of my lifetime, that change has occurred. So this is not a theoretical only problem. It's not only a long-term problem. It's something happening today. And when you get away from the center of the countries, the center of the United States, the center of Europe, and you move closer to the poles, climate change is happening at a much more rapid rate than it is here. And so I just wanted to give you that example so that you could understand. And so when we talk about scientific consensus, keep in mind that the glacier and how it was melting. It's not always a slow and distant thing. And so when scientists report their consensus on a topic, well, what does that exactly mean? So I'm going to show you a slide right after this. And in this slide, there are going to be three pie graphs. And each pie graph is going to be the result, the shortened results of what are called meta-studies. Now, a meta-study is a scientific study that doesn't do its own study. What it does is it looks at many, many, many other studies, hundreds of studies, thousands of studies in some cases, and reports on what the majority of the scientists said in this huge number of studies. Now, meta-studies are always interesting and always important because if one or two studies say something, it's always a questionable issue. But when hundreds, or in this case, thousands of studies say almost the exact same thing, it takes on a much greater weight. So look at the percentages, and we'll talk about them right after this. So as you saw in those three pie graphs, we had 97%, 97.5%, and 98.5%. And the final 98.5% was 10,306 scientists were surveyed through their published peer-reviewed literature. The way this worked was they looked through the papers that have accumulated over time about climate change. And they came up with certain measures to see whether someone was explicitly for, explicitly against, or largely for, or largely against, or a little bit for, a little bit against, and they compiled the numbers. And those large numbers, 97, 97.5, and 98.5, represent the people who are saying quite forcefully that climate change, human-caused climate change, is a real thing. That's what scientific consensus means. So let's take the smallest number and talk about that for a second. So the smallest of these three numbers, also the smallest review, is 97% on one hand and 3% on the other. So the way to think about this is just think about it probabilistically. If I gave you $10,000 and you could bet it on one of two things, you could bet it on something that was 97% sure or something that was 3% sure. Which would you bet your money on? That's the way to think about this. No one is saying anything is 100% certain. Scientists never say anything's 100% certain if they're good scientists. But what they are saying is they're very, 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 very sure. And so when you're looking at this and you hear these large discussions and these either-ors and these weird interpretations, and this person said this and this person said that, it gets confusing and it's hard to know what to think. So think of these three graphs and think of your decision on climate change as a very simple matter of probability. Which would you bet on? the group that's 3% or the group that's 97%. That's how you should think about consensus. It's never 100% sure, but it's very, very likely to be the case. And when you repeat this over 10,306 scientists, the chance that those people are all wrong shrinks, 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 and shrinks. So that's how we should understand scientific consensus. The science behind it, we don't really have time in this format to look at it, but in our public discussions, the words scientific consensus come up all the time. And I want you to understand before we move on to the next section and talk about the press, what scientific consensus means, because that's what it means. And that's why it's such an important phrase. Now, when this topic comes into the public space, something really interesting tends to happen. And this happens almost without fail. What this is that when we talk about the science alone, we have 97 and 3. So that would mean out of 100 scientists, 97 of them would be for climate change, and 3 would be questioning it. They might not even be strongly questioning it. They're just not 100% for it. But when we have a press report, or we have a debate, or we have an article in a newspaper, or we have an article in a magazine, what you get instead is a 50-50 discussion. Here's what I mean by this. Instead of 97 scientists being asked what they think about climate change and 3 being asked what they think, we get 2. We have one who's arguing that there is scientific consensus and one who's arguing against. And in the press, this is how it almost always works. You get a 50-50 balance. It's presented as if, well, it's only fair to give both sides of the argument. And this is where one of the problems arises. So if we're talking about political issues, perhaps we should hear both sides of the argument on climate change, maybe. If we're talking about the science, should it be a 50-50 split? So this is something that really digs into people. They start to worry that perhaps the press would overbalance one way or another. But we're not talking about democracy here. We're not talking about the press here. We're talking about science. Science doesn't really work the same way as these other enterprises do. So how should this public scientific relationship work? Currently, the way it works is that for every one expert that's presenting one side, we have another expert presenting another. And the public perception then becomes that, well, we have 2 people with 2 different equally valid views. But that's not really the scientific case. That's the public case. There's a vast difference between that public 1 versus 1 case and the actual case. What I mean by that is if you were going to represent the scientific case, what you would do is bring 100 scientists in. You would give them each a minute to talk. 97 of them would talk pro-climate change, and 3, for 3 minutes out of 100 minutes, would talk anti-climate change. That would be the proper scientific balance. But this is never what actually happens in our press. This is an example of a fallacy, an informal fallacy called false balance. It's presenting something as balanced, 1 and 1, which isn't actually 1 and 1. Remember earlier I gave you the example. If you had the $10,000, where would you bet it? Would you bet it with the 97% or the 3%? But in our public space, this is not how it's discussed. It's discussed as if it's one person's view versus another person's view, and that's the whole case. So keep in mind what scientific consensus means. Keep in mind how many people we're talking about here. And also keep in mind that there's a sharp dichotomy between how the scientific world functions and how our public world functions. And we shouldn't mistake one for the other. In a press room, I perfectly understand trying to give both sides the argument. But to fairly give both sides of this scientific argument, you would have to do some odd reporting. You'd have to have 97 and 3, or you'd have to one person talk 97% of the time and the other person only 3% of the time, and to accurately represent the science. So keep this in mind in our public sphere. It's a very difficult topic. And when politics gets messed up in there and our ideas of fairness and our ideas of balance get messed up with something that's not actually balanced scientifically, that's overwhelmingly for one side, we should try not to get confused. So try to keep it clear what scientific consensus means and how this functions when it runs into the public sphere. At the very beginning of the video that I would try to explain how a pragmatic ethicist focused on environmental ethics would approach such a complicated and messy problem as this. We have a massive scientific consensus that climate change is real and is a real effect. We have a very split community, politically split, socially split, arguing over the smallest little detail. So what do you do here? The very first thing that a pragmatist is going to say is ethical moralizing is going to get us nowhere. Before I even explain what I mean by pragmatic ethics, let me just start with this. If one group or another screams from their high horse about their moral correctness and the other group's immorality, and the other group screams from their moral high horse about their moral correctness and the other group's immorality, we're going to get nowhere. So the very first premise is this type of dogmatic approach to the problem just isn't going to work. And how do we know that? Because that's basically what's been going on for the last 30 or 40 years. The environmental activists have been screaming, quite rightfully, that the science is in and that this is a real problem. But the way they approached it was a very aggressive moralizing. And this turns off many people on the other side. Now, people on the other side did equally problematic things, where they tend to sing about the free market, and they tend to argue very strongly for individuality and for individual choice, and that they're not really talking to each other. So the very first thing before I even discuss pragmatic ethics is to recognize as a group that what we've been doing up to this point is not working very well. We have a real problem. So what is a pragmatic ethicist? Pragmatic ethicist, for the context here, for me to simplify, I'm going to break down to two things. The very first thing is that you have to begin with ethical pluralism. Ethical pluralism begins with the idea that people with different backgrounds, people with different goodwills can differ ethically on certain issues. This does not mean everything is relative. This does not mean that each person creates their own ethical universe and that each one is equally valid. That's not what ethical pluralism is. Ethical pluralism recognizes that in the United States and worldwide, different people tend to approach ethical problems differently. There's no 100% right or wrong way of approaching these problems. So this ethical pluralism gives you a sort of empathy for other approaches to the same problem. So instead of believing dogmatically that one side is right, or believing dogmatically that the other side is right, it begins with the notion that, well, it's a little bit more nuanced and complicated than one right and one wrong answer. So that's the first stage of pragmatic ethicism. A pragmatic ethicist would take on a topic as complicated as this. Now, the idea is hopefully that this creates a little space. When we instead of doing this, slow down and talk and accept that maybe there might be more than one approach to the problem, then hopefully at least we can find some ground to discuss. The second step is that we need to focus down. We need to be experimental and evidence-based. This is not saying that we need to all become scientists. That's not what I'm saying. If you said something like that, it would immediately splinter our group into an even worse splinter than it already is. What I'm saying is when we sit down with each other at a table to discuss a problem, we need to agree to look at the problem in an evidence-based fashion. We need to look at it experimentally. What this means is that we need to before we begin, lay out some kind of a framework so that we can agree what the result is. Um, this can be very simple in the beginning, or it can be complex. But simple works best in the beginning, especially when we have such a large array of ethical viewpoints on one topic. So it's two main things for something as complicated as this: ethical pluralism and an experimental and evidence-based attitude before we begin. We begin with a sort of pluralism, an ethical pluralism, and we try to approach the problems by looking at evidence and evidence-based solutions. In practice, what does this mean? So right now I want to show you two slides. They're from Pew Research polls. And in the first slide is a bit of bad news. So we shouldn't try to hide that this is a complicated and difficult issue. So in the first slide, there's going to be a bit of bad news. The bad news is that, at least in the United States, the public is extremely split on this topic. The numbers are not promising on large-scale problems like, is climate change a real problem in the world? So on a problem like this, look at the numbers, and we'll talk about them afterwards. But then I want you to dig down a little bit deeper. The second slide is going to try to do that. So remember, we're trying to find some common ground where we can begin, something that people might agree on. And so the second slide is going to be a suggestion of some place where we can pragmatically start, something that even in this diverse group of people, we can find many, if not most people, agree on a certain issue. And so the first slide is to try to show how real this problem is and how split the public is in the United States. And the second slide is to try to show, well, here's a glimmer of hope. Here's a direction we can go. So the first thing we should notice about the first slide is that there's quite a radical difference between what scientists think about climate change and what the general public thinks about climate change. And there's quite a range of views politically on what people think about climate change. So Republicans tend to be somewhere around the 35 to 39% range. Is climate change a real human-caused effect in the world? Democrats are much higher in general. They tend to be 70s to 80 percentiles somewhere, depending on the poll. And independents tend to be, in the middle of these two groups. They tend to be in the 60s to 70 range. These polls have been done any number of times. The ranges are always somewhere around there, although over time they have been increasing slowly for a couple of the groups. So we have a complicated problem here. So the first problem is none of these groups are close to the range of scientists. So we have a communication break there. The science is not getting through to the public in any kind of clear fashion. I gave one reason why this might be the case earlier, and it's our public discourse on science. Our political and social reporting on science is lacking in many ways, and I explained one way that it's lacking. The other problem is that this is less of a scientific issue and it becomes much more of a political issue. People tend to go with their in-group. They tend to side with whoever it is that they side with, whatever the issues might be. So many, not all, but many people will agree with something just because that's what their group agrees with. And so we have this harsh and really very strong split between Democrats and Republicans on this issue. We have 37% and 79%. And so it's no mystery what has happened here. These two groups have caused a political quagmire. Nothing has been done because no one can agree. So that's the bad news. That's the problem. We have a disconnect between the science and the public, and we have even a more radical disconnect between Democrats and Republicans, with independents sitting somewhere in the middle, maybe a little bit closer to the Democratic side. So what do you do? In the second slide, I tried to give you a glimmer of a direction we could take pragmatically. So in this slide, we asked people, well, what about focusing on factories and the kind of pollution that they spit out? Um, and surprisingly, kind of interestingly, this smaller problem, instead of the large problem, changes the probabilities. It changes the focus. So in this, the Republicans jumped up to around 47%. And oddly, the Democrats dropped down to 77%, and even the independents went up a little bit. So here's what I'm saying here, is that when you ask a large-scale problem, it just seems overwhelming. And people tend to dig in their heels, and they tend to go with their in-group. This is a well-known psychological thing. Many people will do it, and the science be damned is the way they'll look at it. But when we look at a smaller, more focused problem, that changes a little bit. So this should give us some hope. It's not that we can't do anything, it's that we can't talk on a large governmental scale. We need to talk on small individual scales. And so that's where I want to begin. Think of the second slide when I talk about the small individual problem and how we can approach it. So when we get onto this smaller, more focused problem, we can do something like this. We have to avoid talking about large-scale governmental solutions to these problems. Because when you talk large-scale governmental solutions in the United States especially, which is, of course, where I'm most familiar, you immediately get a large portion of the public just closes down and will proceed no further. And when you talk about only economically individually based solutions, another large group of the populace will immediately close down and not proceed. So we need to find some middle ground. So this second slide gives us an idea. It should give us a possible solution. So instead of talking about a large-scale government control of all factories, we talk about, on a state-by-state basis, running small experiments. And these experiments are based on accountability, and they're very focused. And so we get both sides to agree that we do not make a national policy, because if we make a national policy, we lose half the populace. And we get both sides to agree we do not rely solely on the market, because if we say that, another half of the populace is going to flee. Instead, we avoid that language. We try to focus on a pluralistic approach. So we get a little bit of both. We get a little bit of both, and we mix them together. We talk about accountability and a small focused experiment on some percentage of factories. Now we know there's a chance here because we have the data to support this solution. And we talk about, well, here's what we're going to try on a small scale. We're going to make it a very focused study, and we're going to decide before we begin, well, what are the results? What are we hoping to gain? And we get both sides to agree to this. So we have an ethical pluralism. We're taking a little bit from one side, a little bit from the other, and we're combining them. At the same time, we're avoiding the dogmatic triggers for both sides and trying to avoid that in our pluralistic model. And secondly, we're trying to maintain an experimental attitude. We need to have some type of agreement on both sides. What does a negative result or positive result look like? And that way, when we sit down later on, we can have some type of agreement where we should go from there. Now, this is a first step, and it's a very small step, admittedly. And it's not the kind of step that's going to solve the entire massive problem. However, in the political state of the United States and in many other countries, even countries where they've taken a more progressive attitude towards climate change, these things are going very slowly. So we need to try something. And so that's what you need to do, is to start on a very small, very focused place where we can get a vast majority of people to agree this is a spot we could try out. And so that is how a pragmatist approaches this. If this doesn't seem to be an explicitly ethical approach, you're right. A pragmatist doesn't believe that there's any sharp dichotomy between ethics and the real world. Taking this approach is an ethical approach. Why is it an ethical approach? Because it's accepting a large scale view and trying to focus it on an experimental problem. That's pragmatic ethics. That's pragmatic ethics in practice. It's not about trying to say what the absolute right or wrong answer is on a topic. It's about trying to get people involved. It's trying to get them to focus on something we can share. It's trying to recognize that we have a community that we're trying to protect down the road. And so that's what a pragmatic ethicist would suggest in a horribly complicated problem like this. To end this video, I want to bring you back to a Portage Glacier. That glacier, I canoed up to it many, many years ago now. This is not a theoretical discussion. It's a real world discussion. This is not something that only is happening in an environmental ethics classroom. This is something that all of us need to think very deeply about. There's an overwhelming scientific consensus on this topic. This scientific consensus is being reported very badly. Even though things have improved over time, the difference between how science approaches this problem and how the public approaches the problem are still light years apart. You are responsible for fixing this. You are the consuming public. When you watch a news show or read a news article and they present this topic as if it's a one-to-one comparison, remember this. Remember what I've said today. It's not a one-to-one comparison. We're mistaking journalistic fairness and scientific methods. They do not work the same. They're very different procedures. And so when one is trying to present the other, things get complicated and confused very quickly. So keep the difference between scientific consensus and political and social fairness in mind. And so when we're moving forward onto complicated problems like this, the pluralism is very important. The pluralism is there to try to get you to see that you need to slow down. You need to have empathy for the other side. When you do that, you can disarm many of the worst discussions, and you can sit down and perhaps find something like the factory's emissions that we can to agree to look at. We can look at it experimentally, and we can look at it as a community. And so just think on that spot. This is not a hopeless problem. This is not something that we should give up on. There is still room that we can move forward if we are willing to give up some of our dogma and sit down with people we may not see completely eye to eye with. So that's my suggestion, my hope at the end of this video.